The phrase official timeline gets used in two very different ways, and the difference matters more than most people realize. In one version, it is a conspiracy theorist's shorthand for the idea that scientists are hiding something, that institutions are suppressing discoveries that would overturn everything, that the truth is being managed by people with reasons to keep it from you. That version is almost always wrong, almost always motivated by something other than genuine curiosity, and almost always ends with someone trying to sell you something. But there is another version, a real one, and it sounds like this. A peer-reviewed paper, published in a respected journal, describes a finding whose date or whose implications cannot be reconciled with the current best understanding of when certain things were supposed to have happened. Researchers argue about it in print. Conferences are held. New dating methods are applied. The interpretation shifts, or it does not shift. And the anomaly sits in the literature like a splinter, impossible to remove, uncomfortable to leave in place. Australia produces that second kind of anomaly with unusual frequency, not because someone is hiding anything, because this continent is genuinely, verifiably, documentably older and stranger and more complex than the standard account of human prehistory has historically been willing to accommodate. Every discovery on this list is real. Every researcher named is real. Every publication referenced exists and can be read. What these 8 findings share is not the drama of conspiracy. They share something quieter and more durable. They share the specific discomfort that good science feels when the evidence refuses to behave the way the existing framework predicted it would. That discomfort is not a threat to knowledge. It is how knowledge grows. Pay close attention. Number 8. The Bradshaw paintings, and a style that has no known origin. In the remote Kimberley region of Western Australia, on sandstone rock faces that have been exposed to the sun for longer than most civilizations have existed, there is a body of rock art so technically accomplished and so stylistically distinctive that it has been causing arguments in the archaeological literature for over a century. The Guion figures, named after the word used for them by the Ingarinian people of the Kimberley, and also known as Bradshaw art after the European pastoralist Joseph Bradshaw, who documented them in 1891, depict elongated human figures rendered with a degree of anatomical proportion and aesthetic refinement that is, to put it plainly, not supposed to be there. The figures wear elaborate headdresses. They carry what appear to be ceremonial objects. Their bodies are shown in dynamic postures, mid-dance, mid-movement, mid-ritual, with a fluency of representation that researchers studying them consistently describe as exceptional for any period of rock art history anywhere in the world. The dating problem is real, and it is unresolved. The organic pigments used to create the Guion figures do not preserve well enough for direct radiocarbon dating. Researchers, including Jean-Jacques Delanoy from the Université Savoie, Mont Blanc in France, and Bruno David from Monash University have used indirect dating methods, primarily the dating of mud wasp nests, built over and beneath the images, to establish minimum ages. The results cluster around 12,000 to 17,000 years for many of the figures, with some researchers arguing for substantially greater ages, based on the weathering of the rock surfaces and the geological context of specific panels. What does not fit the timeline is not merely the age. It is the gap between the Guion figures and the rock art traditions that surround them in the Kimberley. There is a stylistic discontinuity so sharp that some researchers have argued it represents either a break in cultural continuity, a different population of artists, or a tradition so old that its origins have been completely lost from the record. The Ingarinian and other Kimberley peoples have their own understanding of who made these figures, an understanding rooted in their cosmological traditions rather than in radiocarbon dating, and that understanding deserves to be part of any honest account of what we know and do not know about the Guion paintings. What the scientific record currently offers is a style of extraordinary sophistication, dated conservatively to at least 12,000 years, with no identifiable precursor tradition anywhere in Australia or in the broader region. It appeared, it flourished, and then it gave way to the later Wangina tradition. Where it came from is a question the timeline has not yet answered. Number 7. The Jin Mayam engravings, revisited, and what the debate actually proved. In 1996, the announcement of possible dates of up to 75,000 years for rock engravings at the Jin Mayam site in the Northern Territory created one of the most intense and productive controversies in the history of Australian archaeology. The initial thermoluminescence dates, published by Richard Roberts and colleagues, were subsequently challenged and substantially revised downward using different methods, and the scientific community largely moved on, treating Jin Mayam as a cautionary tale about dating methodology. But there are aspects of the Jin Mayam story that did not get resolved by the dating revision, and they are the aspects that belong on this list. The engravings at Jin Mayam consist of cupules, small, circular depressions, pecked into the rock surface, a form of rock marking that appears at sites across Australia and across the world, in contexts ranging from the very ancient to the relatively recent. The revised dates for the Jinmium cupules place them at approximately 10,000 years, which is still significant. But the debate the site provoked had a consequence that outlasted the controversy itself. It forced a systematic reassessment of every dating method being applied to Australian rock art, and produced a generation of researchers whose methodological rigor was substantially higher than what had existed before. What emerged from that reassessment was not the confirmation of Jinmium's extreme dates, but something in some ways more interesting. The recognition that the Australian rock art record contains multiple sites where the combination of indirect dating evidence, surface weathering characteristics, and stratigraphic context points toward ages that strain the existing framework without quite breaking it. The specific finding that does not fit the timeline at Gimium and related sites in the Keep River region is the presence of cupule engraving traditions whose stylistic characteristics and geological context place their origins, by the judgment of researchers, including George Shalupka at the Northern Territory Museum and Robert Bednarik of the Australian Rock Art Research Association, in a time frame that predates the current consensus on when certain forms of symbolic behavior were supposed to have developed in this part of the world. The debate about those origins is ongoing. The evidence is real. And the methodological legacy of the Jinmium controversy is, paradoxically, one of the most productive things to come out of a discovery that turned out to be partly wrong. Number 6. The Primojedbi tools, and the date that won't stay still. In 2017, the publication of findings from the Magidby Rock Shelter in the Northern Territory, establishing a date of at least 65,000 years for human occupation of Australia, was treated by most media coverage as the settling of a long-running argument. Humans arrived approximately 65,000 years ago. Timeline established. Question closed. That is not what the researchers who produced those findings said, and it is not what the evidence supports. The paper by Chris Clarkson and colleagues, published in Nature, was careful to note that the 65,000-year date represented a minimum based on the methods applied and the material sampled, and that the actual date of arrival could be older. But beyond Magidby itself, there is a body of evidence from other sites across Australia that has been accumulating for decades, and that consistently points toward the possibility of human presence on the continent at ages beyond what the current consensus comfortably accommodates. Research by Richard Roberts at the University of Wollongong, examining dates for megafauna extinction at multiple sites across Australia, identified a cluster of sites where the disappearance of large animal species from the fossil record appears to predate 65,000 years ago, which, if human hunting contributed to those extinctions, as the evidence from other sites suggests it did, would imply human presence at correspondingly greater ages. Research by Gurdeep Singh at the Australian National University, examining pollen core from Lynch's crater in Queensland, identified a signal of increased burning in the vegetation record at approximately 120,000 years ago, that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of human fire management, though this interpretation remains contested. The Huon Peninsula, in Papua New Guinea, which was connected to Australia as part of the Sahul landmass during periods of low sea level, has yielded stone tools dated to approximately 40,000 to 60,000 years ago, using methods consistent with those applied at Magidby, with some researchers arguing for dates potentially approaching 100,000 years at specific levels. None of these findings, individually, constitutes proof that humans were in Australia earlier than 65,000 years ago. Together, they constitute a pattern that does not fit cleanly inside the timeline that the 2017 Magidby paper is often misread as having definitively established. The question of when humans first arrived in Australia is not closed. It is open, actively debated, and likely to produce further surprises as new sites are investigated and new dating technologies are applied. Number 5. The Kimberley Points, and a manufacturing tradition without a known teacher. Among the most technically demanding stone tool traditions documented anywhere in the prehistoric world is a form of bifacial point production that emerged in the Kimberley region of Western Australia approximately 3,000 years ago, and that, within a few centuries, achieved a level of flaking refinement that specialists in lithic technology, the study of stone tools, describe with consistent and genuine admiration. The Kimberley points, pressure flaked from glass, porcelain, and backed with Spinifex resin hafting adhesive in their historic forms, and from a variety of cryptocrystalline silicates in their older manifestations, required a manufacturing sequence involving multiple distinct techniques, including platform preparation, indirect percussion, and fine pressure flaking, that takes years of dedicated practice to master. The finding that does not fit the timeline is not the existence of these tools. It is their sudden appearance in the archaeological record at a level of technical sophistication that has no documented developmental sequence leading up to it in the Australian record. Stone tool technologies typically show gradual improvement in the archaeological record, with earlier, cruder versions preceding the refined products of a mature tradition. The Kimberley Point tradition does not show this. It appears in the sites where it has been dated by researchers including Kim Ackerman, one of the foremost authorities on the tradition. Already mature, already refined, already operating at the highest level of technical execution it will ever achieve. Where the knowledge came from, whether it was independently invented, whether it arrived with the population movement, or whether it represents the sudden adoption and rapid mastery of a technique whose developmental stages occurred somewhere not yet identified in the archaeological record, is a question that the existing timeline does not answer. Ackerman's published work on the Kimberley Point tradition is meticulous, and his conclusions careful. But the absence of a developmental sequence in the record is a genuine anomaly that researchers in Australian lithic technology continue to examine without having produced a consensus explanation. Number 4. The ancient Indian Ocean trade evidence, and the visitors who arrived early. For most of the history of Australian archaeology, the continent was treated as essentially isolated from the rest of the world between the time of its initial peopling and the arrival of European ships in the 17th century. That model was always more assumption than evidence. And the evidence that has accumulated over the past few decades has made it increasingly difficult to sustain. The clearest and most documented case of pre-European contact between Australia and the wider world involves the Makassar trepanars, Indonesian fishermen from the Sulawesi port of Makassar, who made regular seasonal voyages to the northern Australian coast to harvest sea cucumbers for the Chinese trade, beginning several centuries before European contact. This contact is well documented in the historical record, in the material culture of Northern Australian Aboriginal communities, in the presence of Makassar loanwords, in Aboriginal languages of Arnhem Land, and in the genetic record, with research published by researchers including David Lambert at Griffith University and colleagues, identifying Makassar genetic contributions to the DNA of some northern Aboriginal Australian communities. But the Makassar contact, dated to roughly 400 years ago, is not the anomaly. The anomaly is the evidence, examined by researchers including Ian McIntosh at Indiana University, and by archaeologists working in Arnhem Land and along the northern coastline, for contact events that predate the Makassar period by centuries or possibly millennia. Coinages from ancient Africa, Southeast Asian ceramic fragments at unexpected ages, anomalous genetic signals in northern Aboriginal Australian populations that do not correspond to the Makassar contact period, and oral traditions describing visitors in large boats arriving before the Macassans, all constitute a body of evidence that does not fit the isolation model neatly. None of this evidence, it must be said clearly, supports the fringe theories of pre-Columbian, European, or Egyptian contact with Australia that circulate on the internet, and that are invariably based on misidentified objects and fabricated provenance. What it does support is the less dramatic but genuinely significant possibility that the maritime world of the Indian Ocean Rim was connected to northern Australia through contact networks that predate the historically documented period by a margin we have not yet been able to precisely establish. Number 3. The Panoramidi, petroglyphs, and the style that crossed a continent impossibly early. Across an area of central and southern Australia, encompassing thousands of square kilometers, on rock surfaces from the Flinders Ranges to the arid heart of the continent, there exists a rock art tradition called the Panoramidi style, characterized by pecked engravings of animal tracks, circles, arcs, and geometric forms, that represents the oldest broadly distributed visual tradition documented in Australia and one of the oldest in the world. Research by researchers including Robert Bednarik and by teams associated with the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies has dated the Panoramidi tradition using multiple, indirect methods, including the measurement of weathering rind thickness, the dating of overlying deposits, and the stratigraphic relationship of Panoramidi engravings to materials of known age. The dates produced by these analyses are not controversial in their existence, only in their precise values, and they consistently point toward a tradition whose oldest expressions are at least 30,000 years old, with some researchers arguing for ages approaching or exceeding 40,000 years. What does not fit the timeline is the distribution. The Panoramidi style appears across an area so geographically extensive, and its sites so distant from each other, that its presence across the entire region at very ancient ages implies either a level of cultural connectivity and long-distance communication across central Australia in the deep Pleistocene, that the prevailing models of that period's population density did not predict, or in antiquity for the tradition even greater than the available dating evidence currently supports. For the tradition to be genuinely contemporaneous across its entire geographic range at 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, the people who made it had to have been in contact with each other, or to have descended from a common tradition across distances of thousands of kilometers. In a landscape that during the last glacial maximum was significantly more arid and resource-poor than it is today, that is not impossible. But it is not what the models of Pleistocene Australian demography had suggested we should find. Number 2. The sun-to-shelf crossing and the boats that cannot be found. This entry concerns not a physical object found in Australia but an object whose existence is absolutely demanded by the evidence, and whose absence from the archaeological record constitutes one of the most significant, unresolved puzzles in the prehistory of human technology. When the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians arrived on this continent between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago, or possibly earlier, they did not walk here. At no point in the last several million years has Australia been connected to Southeast Asia by a continuous land bridge. During the glacial maximum, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today, which brought the islands of what is now Indonesia substantially closer to the Australian landmass. But even at the lowest sea levels of the Pleistocene, the crossing from the Sunda Shelf, the submerged continental shelf of Southeast Asia, to the Sahul Shelf required open water crossings of, at minimum 70 to 90 kilometers, with some route reconstructions suggesting crossings of 150 kilometers or more, across deep ocean trenches that remained water even when sea levels were at their lowest. The research of Robert Bednark, who attempted an experimental crossing of the ancient route, using only materials and technologies available in the Pleistocene, published through the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, and the route reconstruction work of researchers, including Gerrit van den Berg at the University of Wollongong, and colleagues examining the geography of the ancient Wallasian island chain, both point toward the same conclusion. The first Australians crossed open ocean in watercraft of sufficient seaworthiness to carry enough people, probably a minimum of several dozen individuals, to establish a viable founding population, across distances and in conditions that should have been at the absolute limit of what any technology available at that time could achieve. No physical evidence of these watercraft has ever been found. None is likely to be found, given that the organic materials from which Pleistocene watercraft would have been constructed, bamboo, bark, hide, wood, do not survive in the sedimentary record across 50,000 to 65,000 years of time. But their existence is not optional. The people are here. The water was there. The boats were real. And the fact that the first documented evidence of ocean-going watercraft elsewhere in the world is substantially more recent than the Australian crossing, by tens of thousands of years, in some comparative analyses, means that this continent was reached by the most sophisticated maritime technology in the world, at a time when that technology should not yet have existed. That is, the anomaly. It has no resolution that fits comfortably inside the existing timeline, and it will remain unresolved until someone finds evidence of what those first boats were made of, if that evidence exists anywhere at all. Number 1. The Mungo Man mitochondrial DNA results, and the ghost lineage that vanished. In 2001, a research team led by Gregory Adcock at the Australian National University, and including Alan Thorne, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that produced one of the most intense and sustained controversies in the history of molecular anthropology. The team had extracted mitochondrial DNA from the skeletal remains of Mungo Man, the individual buried at Lake Mungo, approximately 42,000 years ago, and from several other ancient Australian individuals, and the sequence they recovered did not match any living human mitochondrial lineage. It did not cluster with the known mitochondrial lineages of Aboriginal Australians, nor with those of any other living human population. It appeared to represent a lineage that had gone extinct, a branch of the human mitochondrial tree that had been present in Australia 42,000 years ago, and that had left no descendants traceable in the modern human gene pool. If genuine, this finding would have been one of the most extraordinary results in the history of human genetics. It would have implied that the founding population of Australia was not homogeneous, that at least some of the earliest Australians belonged to a genetic lineage that was subsequently replaced or absorbed without trace, and that the human story in Australia was more complex and more ancient than any model than current had predicted. The response from the scientific community was immediate and intense. Multiple research teams challenged the Adcock results on methodological grounds, arguing that ancient DNA extraction in 2001 was subject to contamination risks that made the unusual sequence more likely to represent modern DNA contamination or sequencing artifact than a genuine ancient lineage. Subsequent attempts to replicate the findings using improved methods and stricter contamination controls did not recover the same sequence. The current consensus in molecular anthropology does not accept the Adcock results as representing genuine, ancient Australian mitochondrial DNA. But the story does not end there cleanly. The methodological debate about the 2001 paper produced significant advances in ancient DNA extraction and authentication protocols that benefited the entire field. The question the paper raised about whether the founding Australian population contained lineages not represented in the modern gene pool has not been definitively answered in the negative, only in the absence of replication. And a 2016 study by Irina Pujak and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute, examining modern Aboriginal Australian genomes for signals of ancient admixture, identified a signal of genetic input from an unknown source population at approximately 4,000 years ago. A finding that does not resolve the Adcock controversy, but that demonstrates that the genetic history of Aboriginal Australians continues to produce results that the existing models did not predict. The Mungo Man mitochondrial DNA controversy is the most honest possible example of what this list set out to examine. A finding that did not fit the timeline, a scientific community that interrogated it rigorously and found it wanting, a field that moved forward more carefully and more rigorously because the anomaly had forced it to. And a question. The question of whether the full genetic diversity of the people who first inhabited this continent is visible in the populations alive today, that remains, in the most precise and honest scientific sense, open. What these 8 discoveries share is not the quality of having been suppressed or ignored. Every one of them has been published, debated, challenged, refined, and in some cases, overturned by normal scientific process. What they share is the quality of genuine anomaly, of evidence that arrives in the record and refuses to sit quietly inside the framework built to contain it. Australia keeps producing these anomalies because it is genuinely, verifiably, provably different from the place the standard historical narrative describes. The continent is older than the frameworks. The cultures are more sophisticated than the models predicted. The timeline is not wrong because someone is hiding things. It is incomplete because the evidence keeps arriving faster than the frameworks can absorb it. That is not a scandal. That is science working exactly as it should. Slowly and imperfectly, and driven by the obstinate refusal of reality to match our expectations of it. If that process interests you, if the space between what we know and what the evidence is trying to tell us feels like the most alive place in any field of inquiry, stay with us. There is always more arriving, and Australia is always at the front of the line.